So we've got 90 minutes for this session, but wanted to make it as interactive as possible. We've got a few slides that we're going to roll through, but it's not extensive. So we should be done with those slides fairly promptly, but wanted to leave plenty of time at the end for Q&A. And so we don't have a Slido happening this morning. The Q&A will be, feel free to come off mute and ask your question verbally or fire it into the chat. And we'll run Q&A through the chat. And so we'll probably be done with the slides, well within the hour, and then we'll go with the Q&A for as long as needed, and we've got that extra 30 minutes if we need to. Okay, so before we kick off, I wanted to acknowledge the traditional owners of country throughout Australia and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and culture. Pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Where I am, I'm on the land of the Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and I'm sure everybody on the call pays their respects to traditional owners where you are in Australia. Also wanted to acknowledge ARENA. This is an ARENA acknowledgement and disclaimer. This project is very grateful for the funding that we received from ARENA as part of the Advancing Renewables program. Thank you to ARENA. We've got a fairly tight agenda. We're going to go through a bit of the background and context on the VPP Demonstrations program, a bit of a participant update on where we've ended up, just some high-level insights, but mainly focused on the recommendations coming out of the final knowledge sharing report. That was published a couple of weeks ago now, and hopefully you've had a chance to read that. But if you haven't, what we'll do is we'll just fire the links into the chat so that you have the links there to peruse at your leisure, and then we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. So what is a virtual power plant? I'm sure pretty much everyone on the call is going to be familiar with what a virtual power plant is, but we'll just cover it at a high level anyway. So it can be a collection of a variety of resources. It can be at large scale or at distribution level. The virtual power plant demonstrations focused at distribution level, residential and commercial level. Virtual power plants that can be technology neutral and can be a collection of resources that can produce electricity or actively manage demand and operate as a virtual power plant, so delivering services as a collective. Some context around the VPP demos is that we first launched this concept back in 2018. And at that time, there were a number of subsidy programs being thought about among the state governments to incentivise residential battery storage uptake. So there was the SA home battery scheme that was looking to incentivise a number of residential battery systems. There was the SA virtual power plant, and together those two schemes were really targeting about 90,000 systems being installed over the next kind of 3 to 4 years. There was also a potential at that time for the Vic government to incentivise batteries. They have since done so, and the New South Wales government was looking into a couple of programs, and there was one that emerged called Empowering Homes, which was looking to incentivise quite a large number of battery systems over the next 10 years. And so at that time, we at AEMO could see that there was a potential for a very rapid uptake of residential battery storage systems across the NEM, potentially in the hundreds of megawatts over a short period of time. And where solar PV, rooftop PV is quite easy to forecast for us. As long as we know where it is, we can forecast how that's going to behave quite easily. Residential battery storage was a different task. to be able to forecast it. We didn't have any visibility of it whatsoever, and if it was going to be invested in and installed at large quantities across the system, and we didn't have any visibility, then that could potentially create system security risks that we wanted to get ahead of. And so the virtual power plant demonstrations was really a concept where we wanted to get ahead of the curve on the residential battery storage uptake and on the VPP uptake, and learn about VPPs while they're small, so that we can implement appropriate operational changes or inform appropriate regulatory changes to make sure that we get the best out of VPPs going forward and they don't present system security risks. So that's really the context to the origins of the VPP demos. We launched a consultation process in November of 2018. At that time, there was no VPPs doing FCAS in the NEM. And then we ended up going through that consultation process and publishing a final design document the following year in 2019, and we launched the demonstrations in July of 2019. And in that final design document, we had a number of objectives that came out of the consultation process. So the overarching objective really was to test VPPs delivering contingency FCAS, frequency control ancillary services, and we established a trial specification to enable that. We wanted to obtain operational visibility of VPPs so that we can learn how they're behaving, how they're responding to energy price signals, and we wanted to use this data to inform changes to regulatory and operational frameworks. And that was the overarching goal. Beneath that, there were 5 stated objectives that we published in the final design document. The first one was around value stacking, so really looking to observe how VPPs, how effective they are at delivering contingency FCAS and also responding to real-time energy price signals, and also, if possible, to observe how they're delivering local network support services if that use case were to come up. We'll just ask everybody to roll on to mute if you can. And the second one was around visibility. So visibility was really the primary goal for the VPP demos, to observe how VPPs operate, how they behave, how they respond to signals. We needed to develop a number of systems to obtain that visibility, and so we developed a number of application programming interfaces to receive that data. The third objective was really about informing change, so we wanted to use the VPP demos to assess the current regulatory and operational arrangements, and then use this project to develop an evidence base that then informs subsequent change. We wanted to use this project to have a specific focus as well on improving consumers' experiences of being part of a VPP. Obviously very conscious that at the beginning of this project, the VPP sector was really nascent, and it was a good opportunity to understand how consumers experience being part of a VPP, and hopefully we wanted to provide some insights to the industry to help them improve consumers' experiences going forward. We also wanted to have a particular focus on cybersecurity, to understand what cybersecurity measures VPPs currently implement and whether any change is required going forward. So these were the stated objectives, and we really wanted to use these as a reference point throughout the project. And so you'll see from the knowledge sharing reports that we've published that we've sought to address these objectives throughout. So we then took a number of actions to facilitate the delivery of those objectives, and I'll just roll around this this wheel from the top. So the first objective around value stacking, we sought to test a VPP demos trial specification for FCAS delivery. So that was effectively an addendum to the market ancillary services specification that allowed us to test some slightly different approaches in the VPP demos. One of those was around the measurement of the delivery of fast FCAS and what sampling rate of data is required to verify the delivery of fast FCAS. The current market ancillary services specification requires 50 millisecond metering, and in the VPP demos, we allowed participating VPPs to use 1 second data to verify the delivery of the FCAS service, and that's now rolled into the mass consultation process, which is currently ongoing, and we'll cover a little bit more on that later. We also developed a whole load of enrolment information and guidelines. So we had to develop a new enrolment form, an enrolment guideline to help participating VPPs navigate that form and develop all the necessary information. We developed a whole load of API guidelines to help participating VPPs develop the APIs or integrate with the APIs in order to share data. We also had to develop those APIs on our end in order to facilitate the data sharing component of the VPP demos. We had a specific data specification that outlined all of the data that was required from the participants. We were very conscious that by allowing VPPs to test a more lenient specification to access the FCAS markets, we wanted to, in return, obtain quite a decent amount of data. So you'll note, if you have a look at the data specification, it's quite extensive and actually was quite probably was a little bit onerous for the participating VPPs to actually deliver all of that data. But we thought by allowing them to access these FCAS markets with a more lenient specification, we could put quite strong data obligations onto the participants, and that could really help with the deliver a more valuable data set to analyze. We also took actions around the bidirectional provision of FCAS. So an AMO policy prior to the VPP demos was that there was effectively only kind of unidirectional delivery of FCAS. Now, what that means is if you were a market customer or a market ancillary services provider, effectively a load connection point or an aggregation of load connection points looking to deliver FCAS, then net exports from those connection points were not recognised for the delivery of RAISE FCAS. Now, that was really a restriction, I guess, on the ability for VPPs to be genuinely bidirectional. And in the VPP demos, we allowed those net exports to be recognised for RAISE FCAS in the demonstrations, and very quickly it made sense that should be applied externally. And so early on in the VPP demos, we then published what's referred to as the interim arrangements for the provision of FCAS from DER. And those interim arrangements basically allowed the bidirectional provision of FCAS outside of the demonstrations. And those arrangements are now being embedded into the ongoing mass, so that there won't be the interim arrangements anymore as a result of the current mass consultation. That will be embedded in the ongoing mass going forward. So that's a change that was that occurred early on in the demonstrations. We also took actions to engage a company called CSBA, who were specialists at customer research, to conduct a specific consumer insights, a piece of research, and that was quite an extensive customer insights project. We'll come on to that in a little bit more detail later on. But that was a longitudinal study that ended up having almost 2,000 customers involved in that research. It involved a benchmarking survey at the beginning of their involvement in the VPP Demos project. We then took a much smaller group and did some more detailed interviews and qualitative research. And then there was a subsequent benchmarking survey at the end of that project. And there's a separate final report that CSBA has published. It was published alongside the final report for the demonstrations project as a whole. That was published a couple of weeks ago as well. And that's a really strong and interesting report. Really encourage everybody to read that consumer insights report. In order to facilitate that report, we actually included it as in the terms and conditions of participating in the project that participating VPPs were required to communicate with their customers to invite them into this customer insights research. It wasn't mandatory to take part, but it was mandatory to invite a portion of their customers to take part, and a number of customers did volunteer to take part. And then the final set of actions around to deliver on the objectives relates to cybersecurity. So we developed a specific cybersecurity questionnaire on registration, and that was based on the Australian energy sector cybersecurity framework questionnaire. That's a much broader cybersecurity framework that applies to the broader energy industry, and there's a broader questionnaire on cybersecurity that those participating entities have to complete. We developed a cut down version of that specifically for VPPs and required participating VPPs to complete that on registration. We also engaged during the project with MITRE, which is an organisation in the US that does a lot of work with the US government on cybersecurity. They actually approached us because they were aware of the VPP Demonstrations project and they wanted to specifically examine the VPP use case from a cybersecurity perspective. And so after they approached us, we invited participating VPPs to engage with MITRE. And so MITRE did some work there, and the learnings from that are included in the final report that we published a couple of weeks ago. I will just say that if you have any questions as we go through, feel free to fire them into the chat. I'll keep an eye, or Amanda and I will keep an eye on the chat. And if there's any questions that come through as we're rolling through the slides, we'll try and address them there and then. But feel free to keep your questions to the end as well, if you like. Okay, so the participant update. So we ended up with 8 portfolios participating in the VPP demos across 7 different participants, and in all them mainland states. And in total, there's 31 megawatts participating, of which there's 27 megawatts in South Australia. And so that's quite extensive. We started off when we launched in July 2019, we had 1 participant shortly after launch, which was the Energy Locals Tesla VPP, the South Australian VPP. AGL joined shortly after, And then we decided to extend the VPP demos. Originally, it was scheduled to run for a year, and we extended it by a further year. And as a result of that, we had a further 6 participating portfolios join. And this is across every mainland state. You can see that we've got a mix of market customers, which is effectively retailers, and market ancillary service providers, which are basically third-party aggregators. They're not retailers, which is a good diversity. I mentioned at the beginning that we wanted to make this open to any technology that wanted to join. So we definitely made the final design of the demonstrations technology neutral. We wanted to encourage a variety of different technologies to join. We were definitely talking with other technology providers that were looking to build some scale, but unfortunately there was a minimum requirement to enter the FCAS markets of 1 megawatt, and so other technologies that we were engaging with, like pool pumps and hot water providers, weren't able to hit the 1 megawatt scale in time to join. But I think that there is certainly interest from other technologies out there in providing FCAS going forward. We did have diversity in residential and commercial. So the Hydro Tasmania VPP in Queensland is at a commercial scale. It's using Tesla power packs. Although most of the participating VPPs are using Tesla equipment, we do have some diversity in the batteries. We've got Sonnen, Alpha ESS, and Everready there. We had some diversity in the delivery characteristic of FCAS. So FCAS delivery, you may be aware, or we mentioned this in the knowledge sharing reports, it can be delivered in 2 ways. The delivery has to be characterized as either proportional, or you can refer to that as variable. That means that there is a droop setting that is applied to the equipment, to the portfolio, and that delivers a proportional response. So depending on the severity of the frequency excursion, the delivery is proportional to that excursion. So it effectively produces this butterfly effect when you see it on the charts. It exactly mirrors what the frequency deviation is doing. A switch response is really an on-off response. So once the frequency is detected to go outside of the normal operating band, it switches on or off depending on the direction and of the delivery, and it's not proportional. So we did have some diversity there. We also had diversity in that the Sonnen portfolio delivers a dynamic switch response, and so it can be characterized as proportional, even though it is fundamentally using switching technology. It is characterized as a proportional response. And we had diversity across all contingency FCAS markets as well. So we ended up with a really strong group of participants involved in the project. And although we didn't have as much technology diversity as we would have liked, we still did have some good diversity, which was great. The enablement growth over time is shown in this chart. So we've got, as I mentioned before, we started out pretty small in October 19, but then by July 2020 and throughout the remainder of 2020, we had a further 5 or 6 VPPs coming on board, and each of the VPPs have also, or a few of the VPPs have also grown more than their original registration capacity. So they continue to grow their portfolios over this time. So now we can see that we have regularly a collective of over 20 megawatts bidding into the markets. And here's a revenue update. So this shows the monthly revenue across across all of the VPPs participating, all the way up to August 2021. So you can see that FCAS revenues are highly event driven. The revenues in February 2020, that was in relation to a separation event that occurred between South Australia and Victoria, where there was that separation lasted for a couple of weeks, and in that couple of weeks, the FCAS markets were pretty much at the market cap for most of that time, and so there was a large amount of FCAS revenues that occurred in that month. And then there was another event in March 2021. But outside of those events, you can see that FCAS revenues are kind of fairly steady, and the growth in recent months relates to the growth of the VPP capacity as well. Typically, over the course of a year on a per connection point basis, you might expect revenues from FCAS to be, 200-300 megawatts per NIMI over the course of a year, something in that order. But it's because it's so event driven, it's very difficult to forecast, and it's very difficult to forecast in the short term, let alone in the long term as well. So if you talk to people that are looking to forecast FCAS revenues into the future, that's a very, very difficult task. But it's probably not something that is going to be the primary driver of a commercial decision, but it certainly is. Certainly has provided, or this evidence does provide an insight that it is revenues that could be worth having. So into some of the insights and recommendations. So we won't go into too much detail on the insights. There's a number of charts throughout all of the knowledge sharing reports that we've published over the last couple of years. We've published 4 knowledge sharing reports in total. The last one was published a couple of weeks ago. This chart is taken from that last report. It really shows a response to the CALID trip in January of this year, where we had a number of VPPs that were enabled from the demonstrations during that trip. And this chart really gives an insight into the kind of the bidding behavior and the delivery of FCAS from those VPPs. It's typically showing the purple shaded area shows the amount of over delivery that each of the VPPs that were enabled provided. This is really showing that VPPs have been observed to bid quite conservatively because of the clawback process and the risk of under delivery. There is an incentive for VPPs to bid conservatively to make sure that they've got capacity to deliver on the amounts that they're enabled for. So the kind of the over delivery ranges from between 2%, which is fairly tight margin, to up to 10%, and it grows. It kind of fluctuates over time depending on how many NIMIs are in the portfolio and how much extra capacity they have and what the NIMIs are doing at any given time as well. And so one of the key requirements of a VPP for market participation is to have that visibility of what their portfolio is doing at any given time and using that information to inform how they're going to bid into the markets. Oh, okay, thanks, Pippa. So I'm assuming that people can still see the screens. Let me know if you can't. Oh, thumbs up, that's great. So yeah, VPPs typically bid quite conservatively. They have to have that visibility of what their portfolio is doing at any given time, and they also have to take into account any communication dropouts that they have at any given time as well. So we've learned through the demonstrations that we have the data that we're receiving in real time can vary depending on whether there's communication dropouts from the VPPs themselves, and so they could have, you know, dropouts of up to 10% of their portfolio not providing data at any given time because of Wi-Fi dropouts, perhaps, and so they have to take that into account in how they're bidding into FCAS. So this next chart shows the typical responses to energy price signals across. This is across 4 different VPPs, and this is showing average operational profiles and average daily prices per region. So it's not showing responses to individual energy price events. But what it does show is that VPPs operate on a pretty fairly predictable. Oh, I think I've just lost the slides. Let me just bring those up again.
Got them back.
We'll just get back to that. Okay, so VPPs typically operate to prioritize the self-consumption of their customers' PV. That's their kind of default mode of operation. And these kind of charts support that. So they're charging in the daytime, they're typically discharging in the evening, and that evening discharge also typically coincides with where price spikes most often occur. Now, what you'd find if we showed responses to individual price events, what we've observed and what we've learned is that some VPPs do respond to individual energy price spikes, that occur, you know, over, let's say, 500 or 1,000 bucks a megawatt hour or even greater. But that's not consistent across all VPPs. Some of the reasons for that might relate to their customer contracts. Some VPPs have restrictions in their customer contracts about the amount of times that they can utilize the customer devices, or restrictions around how far the storage capacity can be depleted. So they can't use the batteries or individual batteries if they're lower than a 20 or 30% state of charge, things like that. And so that can impact the types of energy price events that VPPs respond to. And even within the same VPP, it sometimes responds to some price signals, but sometimes not to others. And so for that reason, it's very difficult for AEMO to forecast the behavior of these VPPs consistently and accurately. And that's, you know, one of the key insights coming out of that has been that as VPPs scale, AEMO would ideally like to have operational visibility of those VPPs going forward. We've had it in the VPP demonstrations, but as the project is winding up, we no longer have that visibility, and there is evidence through this project that that there is a material need for that visibility going forward. Now, this chart gives a bit of insight into operational visibility as well. So This is showing the forecast profiles that we receive from participating VPPs on 2 days, on 11th of October 2020 and in March 2021. We can see these profiles by these coloured lines here, and the charging in the orange and discharging in the dark blue. Now, on the 14th of March, there was a transmission line outage that required minimum scheduled demand to remain above 400 megawatts in South Australia for system security, and AEMO actually gave that signal to SAPN in South Australia. And the forecasts on this day overestimated the capacity of VPPs to charge in this kind of mid to late afternoon time. You can see that here. In keeping demand above that threshold. So there was, I guess in short, you can see that the charging that occurred really maxed out earlier in the day. So a lot of the batteries became full and couldn't charge anymore earlier in the day, and they actually didn't. Although they provided some benefit in the minimum demand time, they maybe could have provided more benefit in the minimum demand time if they had delayed some of the charging to occur. So if they had exported or allowed their PV to export during the mid-morning and delayed the charging to occur later in the morning, then they could have had a greater impact than they did on the minimum demand. Now, as they scale, as VPPs scale in capacity, that the level of forecasting error could have implications for how we manage the supply-demand balance. So thinking of VPPs at very large scale, this table down the bottom here shows the kind of mean absolute error compare of the SA VPPs compared to large-scale solar. So large-scale solar, much easier to forecast. They typically have up to 5% error, and when it's 5 minutes ahead, that error is much reduced. But with the VPPs, what we've observed is that the error is, as you'd expect, greater than that of a large-scale solar farm, and it doesn't necessarily get better between 5 minutes or a day ahead. Now, that's probably to be expected because we're in a really early part of this industry, but we'd like to observe that forecasting error improve over time, and we have observed that improvement during the VPP demonstrations. But as VPPs scale, we're going to have to work together with the industry to try and improve the forecasting error as an industry. So we just got a question from Bryn. On the 14th March, looks like the forecast was out for the total amount of energy, not just the timing of charging. Any insights as to why that was? That's a good question. Might take that one on notice, Bryn, and reach out afterwards. Yeah, I think you're right. We can engage with the VPPs to understand why that was. And Jitendra, yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think this is likely to change with 5-minute markets coming in. So
thanks,
operational, no problem. Operational visibility. So the recommendations really coming out of visibility and what we learned in the demonstrations was that VPPs and more broadly price responsive demand are at quite material capacities in the NEM, particularly in South Australia when it comes to VPPs. And that is impacting our operational forecasting team is finding that it's impacting their ability to forecast the supply demand balance periods of price volatility. And as VPPs scale, it's going to be more and more important to have that visibility to maintain an efficient operation of the power system, particularly at those times of system stress that coincide with price volatility. And so you'll see in the final report, we've highlighted 3 key recommendations relating to operational visibility. One is to accelerate the design and implementation of the scheduled light concept. So that's something that's coming out of the ESB post 2025 reforms. The visibility that we've had through this project of VPPs is definitely informing the thinking around scheduled light. So it's not necessarily a concept right to participation in the central dispatch process. It could start with just having visibility of VPPs in a way that's similar to what we had in the VPP demonstrations, and then it could progress over time to go from visibility to then having some more information that can inform forecasting, to have forecastability of VPPs and these other assets, to then eventually becoming scheduled or participating in some way in the central dispatch process, and that progression would align with the scaling of different types of resources. So as part of that recommendation as well, we mentioned that it's worth considering mandating that initial level of visibility for resources that exceed material thresholds. So, for example, VPPs in South Australia. Now, the material thresholds that we have in mind could align with the thresholds that have recently been put in place for wholesale demand response. So there are some thresholds there, and in South Australia, that's 30 megawatts as a regional threshold for the total amount of resources in that category. And so with VPPs being at kind of 27 megawatts in South Australia, they're already getting close to that threshold of materiality. The next recommendation was for AEMO to review the data communication standard with reference to appropriate standards to facilitate this visibility model. So AEMO is soon to be launching a consultation of the data communication standard, and part of that will be looking to explore new ways and hopefully new, more cost-effective ways for these types of resources to submit data into the SCADA system. There's a report that the AMC commissioned as part of one of their rule changes recently from GHD and hard software that highlighted the costs of participants connecting to the SCADA system to provide that operational visibility, and the costs are currently quite extensive. Part of this data communication standard review would be to explore more cost-effective ways to get data, that type of data, into the system. And then the third recommendation was really to continue to engage with forecast service providers and with the broader industry to uplift the forecasting capability of the sector. That's something that is going to be ongoing. The third objective that we had was about assessing the regulatory settings for VPPs. So we kind of split that into assessing the FCAS regulatory settings and assessing settings for energy. So this slide really focuses on FCAS. So in the demonstrations, the evidence really shows that VPPs are highly capable of delivering contingency FCAS as a resource, but what the ongoing requirements should be for measurement and verification of those resources delivering FCAS is something that is the subject of the ongoing mass consultation. So we launched that, or AEMO launched that in early 2021 with an intent to align that consultation process with the end of the VPP demonstrations project, so that whatever the ongoing arrangements are, they then kind of transition to those ongoing arrangements going forward. So that consultation process is still ongoing, and I think there's a public forum on that later on this week. As part of the learnings from the demonstrations and from that consultation process, we think that it's important to establish a consultative forum to collaborate with the industry, with VPPs, and importantly with DNSPs on issues relating to the mass and to the scaled delivery of FCAS from DER. So some of those things that need to be worked through include the prioritization of services. So particularly where you have VPPs that are delivering local network support services as well as FCAS, what the prioritization of those services should be. You'll see from the final report that there is some evidence of the value stacking local network services with FCAS in South Australia, with Energy Locals VPP working with SAPN to deliver a local VoltVar response in addition to and simultaneously with a FCAS response. And the learnings from that could inform this broader topic of prioritisation of services. There is also something we need to work through around possible mandating of compliance with AS4777.2/2020, which is the latest version of AS4777 that comes into force in December of this year. The potential benefits of that would be to reduce the risk of disconnection of inverters when there is let's say a voltage disturbance. If there's a voltage disturbance that causes a disconnection of a portion of inverters, and that coincides with a frequency disturbance, and then they're not able to provide their FCAS response, that's a potential risk if they're not going to be there to provide that service. And so compliance with this new standard should help reduce that risk going forward. There's a topic around firmware upgrade arrangements that we need to work through as an industry. So you'll see from the final report that we highlight cases that occurred during the demonstrations of under-delivery of FCAS. And you'll see that under-delivery most commonly occurred as a result of a firmware upgrade error. So a setting being changed or not changed during a firmware upgrade that then led to an under-delivery. And so this is one of the areas that we like to work through, just having agreed processes in place, so that firmware upgrades can be done in a robust and diligent way to make sure that risk of error is reduced. The next one is around the implementation of dynamic operating envelopes for contingency FCAS. So that same project that SAPN was running, the Advanced VPP Grid Integration project, that was looking into the use of flexible export limits, which is the term that SAPN have used, but it can also be referred to as the dynamic operating envelope. And they were shown to be very effective at allowing the delivery of or the exports at a particular connection point to exceed the traditional 5 kilowatt limit. So they've shown that connection points can be allowed to export greater than 5 kilowatts and perhaps up to 10 kilowatts during most of the year even. And that could enable a greater delivery of FCAS if it's applied to a portfolio of resources that are allowed to export up to 10 kilowatts instead of 5 kilowatts. That could allow a greater delivery of FCAS, greater enablement amounts of FCAS. Equally, if there is network congestion at a particular time, those dynamic operating envelopes could be reduced at particular times. And there's a question mark over that we as an industry just need to work through around, okay, you have a dynamic operating envelope that might apply for system normal, but could that envelope be allowed to be greater for contingency events? So could you have like a tiered system of dynamic operating envelopes where you have a system normal envelope, but also a contingency envelope that is greater than that? It basically allows resources to go outside of the system normal envelope for brief periods if they're delivering a contingency service. And then the last one relates to improving the processes around portfolio upgrades. So that's something that relates to the registration process for portfolios of resources as they're adding connection points to their portfolio. There's potential efficiency gains that we can make by addressing the processes that are currently in place. There's also a future mass consultation that the VPP demos learnings may inform that relates to fast frequency response. That's going to be coming up in early next year. And then something that's probably looking a little bit further ahead is regulation FCAS. So currently there's no participants in regulation FCAS that are not scheduled resources. So they're scheduled for energy and also scheduled regulation FCAS, and they receive a set point every 4 seconds through the SCADA system. That's something that we need to explore as an industry, is how would a residential VPP or small commercial VPP potentially deliver regulation FCAS? Would they need to be scheduled for energy and receive that set point? And would that be different in any way to the way that current large-scale resources deliver regulation FCAS? The regulatory settings for VPPs with energy. So a lot of this relates to ongoing reforms that are already in place. So the ESB post 2025 reforms, particularly scheduled light, and then later the flexible trading arrangements, encourage you to have a look at the ESB advice to ministers and associated material. Also the integrating energy storage systems rule change, which is going to allow, it's going to basically eliminate the small generation aggregator category and allow integrated resource providers to deliver FCAS. So these are existing rule change processes that the learnings from the VPP demonstrations will feed into to help inform scheduled light, for instance, and what that might look like. Okay, in the meantime, I might address Pippa's question. Is there any appetite from VPP participants to participate in regulation FCAS? I imagine this would be much more onerous on customer batteries. Yeah, I mean, that's a fair point, something that we're keen to learn about. And something that we weren't able to learn about in the VPP demos. It was kind of out of scope for the VPP demos because a requirement for participating in regulation FCAS is that you're scheduled for energy as well. But over time, if there are VPPs that become scheduled for energy, that's something that we could explore. And as part of that, it would be really interesting to observe the impact on customer batteries as well. So the customer insights. Yeah, this was a really extensive project that ran alongside the VPP demonstrations. Really encourage you to have a look at the final CSBA report. There is a number of kind of recommendations coming out of that report. I'll just summarize a few of them. So it recommends to improve the kind of quality and relevance of information for consumers to enhance their engagement and retain their engagement. So they found that customers were super engaged to begin with, and maybe towards as their involvement in the VPP continued, There were some customers that kind of tailed off their engagement a little bit, and it would be useful to, if you wanted to try and keep them engaged, to kind of keep providing regular quality and relevant information to them. Early adopters are still the ones that are really driving the uptake of VPPs, although we're kind of getting into slightly broader parts of the market now. But if you're a VPP that's just starting out, it's probably useful to target early adopters to attract them into your VPP to begin with, and then to develop a strategy to attract other segments of customers as the market matures and as you as a VPP mature. We also found in this study that although customers are interested in and are motivated by factors like being independent, or having an element of independence through having the battery and being part of a VPP, they're motivated by being part of a community, they're motivated by environmental reasons, but still the primary motivation for customers is really cost. So a focus on cost savings and how your offering is delivering those cost savings for the consumers that you're targeting. That is a key area to focus on if you're starting out. Supported by individual energy bill reviews, for instance, to ensure that what the customers are kind of signing up to kind of prove over time through the energy bill reviews that you're delivering on those expectations. That can help with the customer experience as well. Customers really loved having an app that they could look at every day. The app is a really strong tool to help improve the customer experience. So one of the recommendations is to really develop a strong app experience, because that's something that's really valued by consumers. It's also something to keep an eye on is customer switching. So how you develop strategies to target customers switching into your VPP, and also keeping an eye on replacements. It's probably a little bit early at the moment given the lifetime of these assets, but thinking about how the different business models might play out for replacement of customer equipment. And also to broaden the appeal to consumers. So it's recommended to explore initiatives that broaden appeal to different types of consumers, and particularly thinking about those other motivating factors like community benefits or environmental benefits to attract and retain new customers. And then the final recommendation is around the customer service staff. This is a really kind of quite technical and complex part of the industry, and investment in customer service staff to really have those detailed conversations with customers to put the customer concerns at ease, or to answer customer questions, is really valuable if you're a VPP starting out.
Matt, I might just pause you there. There's a question here from Pavina in the chat.
Oh yeah.
Around commenting on future standardization of communication protocols.
Yeah, so that's a good question, Pavina. Thank you for that. So, yeah, there is a need across the industry to think about how information is exchanged efficiently across the industry. So this project didn't look at the communication from all the way down to the device. So we only focused on developing APIs for aggregators to send data from the aggregator to AMO as the market. So it's just sending aggregated data to us in those APIs. So we didn't align those APIs to any particular standard in the demonstration. There is question marks over whether standards should be put in place for aggregator to device, or whether that should be open to whatever communication protocol different providers prefer to use. But also with the emergence of the use case of DNSPs wanting to send dynamic operating envelopes to aggregators, there is, and rightly so, a movement among that part of the industry to look to standardize that communication. So how they send a dynamic operating envelope to aggregators, looking to make sure that that is done in a standardized way. And so they've recently published an Australian implementation guide for 2030.5. We can maybe dig that up and put a link to that in the chat in a few minutes. And so I think that is very worthwhile. But in terms of future communications with AMO, we're not specifying 2030.5 at the moment, but it's certainly something that we're considering. So we'll just move on to cybersecurity. So this really is just a visual that highlights the different interactions of different actors in the market when it comes to VPPs. But the risks that were identified through the demonstrations and through that work with MITRE really come down to securing the remote instruction of the DER fleet. So when an aggregator is sending out an instruction to a DER fleet, making sure that that aggregator's infrastructure is cyber secure, making sure that the DER device isn't responding to is responding to remote instructions in a timely fashion. So if that is intercepted or tampered with, or that communication is tampered with in any way, that could have cybersecurity risks. And similarly, if the device is behaving incorrectly in response to a required instruction, then that could be a cybersecurity risk. So the recommendations really coming out of the demonstrations are to engage in this voluntary code of practice that is published by the federal government. There's also an energy sector specific cybersecurity framework, the AES CSF, which is much broader than VPPs, but it is across the energy sector, and it is thinking about the VPP use cases. And cybersecurity is really being driven by the federal government at the moment, and AMO is engaging closely with them on cybersecurity risks. That's another one of a set of recommendations coming out of the ESB work. So I'll just wind up now. I'm just conscious we've kind of run over time, but we've still got some time now for questions. But while you're thinking about questions to ping into the chat, some of the key takeaways. The demonstrations really have proven the capability of VPPs to deliver contingency FCAS and to respond to energy price signals, and also to deliver local network services as well. So they've proven a strong capability to deliver a range of services. The sector has started very, very small 2 years ago. They've grown a lot in the last 2 years. They're at a material capacity in South Australia, but I'd probably still suggest that the sector is in an early development phase, but it could grow quite quickly from here. We're in the process of completing the mass consultation to settle the ongoing arrangements for the measurement and verification of FCAS. And that should provide some certainty to the sector going forward. The customer experience work has been a hugely valuable part of this project, and the overwhelming response from customers has been that they've got very high levels of satisfaction with being part of a VPP at the moment. And they're obviously keen as an industry to see that continue. So hopefully the insights that have been included in that final CSBA report can help the industry keep that high level of satisfaction and potentially improve it going forward. You'll see from the ESB post-2025 reforms that there's quite a big focus on the role of the aggregator going forward, and particularly in this concept of flexible trading arrangements going forward. So really encourage any of you that are interested in this space to get involved in that ESB work to understand those flexible trading arrangements, and then to get involved in the consultation processes as they occur over the coming months. I guess to wind up, the VPP demo is really aimed to take a slightly different approach to what AMO's done in the past, and to seek to really take a collaborative approach to integrating an emerging sector and VPPs in this instance. We wanted to really take a focus on informing change with evidence, and to use this project to develop that evidence base over a period of time that can then inform change, either through the mass consultation or through other regulatory reforms like the ESB work. But what we've found is that this project has developed quite a large evidence base, which then can be used to inform change over the coming years. And we've generally had really good feedback on that approach through this project. But it doesn't stop here. You know, we're very conscious that we need to continue that collaboration with industry as the sector develops over time. And I guess the next step, once the mass consultation winds up, the next step and the next area of focus is really that operational visibility, how we implement useful but not overly onerous requirements on VPPs to provide that operational visibility going forward in a way that is going to ensure that we can operate the power system efficiently, but is not going to be too onerous on VPPs as they grow. And then finally, I just really wanted to say a huge thank you to everybody that's engaged with us over the last couple of years. It's been quite a long project, and we've had a number of you in the industry that have engaged with us throughout that period of time, and a number of people who've helped us along the way. We couldn't have achieved this project without the participation of the industry, not just those actually participating in the demonstrations project itself, but also those that took part in the consultation or who we've engaged with through the knowledge sharing processes. So massive thank you to everybody that has been involved along the way. So with that, I'll pause and we'll just roll into some Q&A. So feel free to come off mute if you like, or just fire questions into the chat.
Hey mate, Anthony here. I just thought I'd jump in and say hello and thank you to you and all the team for the work. Are you able to hear me? Quickly checking.
Yes, all good, thanks.
Thank you. I had a terrible moment. I thought I was just talking to myself, which is probably not that unusual. Just to get the questions off, in terms of the communications, are you thinking this applies to the home as an entity, like to the connection point, or you're envisaging that there'll be more device to device sort of communications that's interacting with the grid itself, or is that separation of the home energy system sort of the consumer area, and then also that leads to the questions of device portability and the ability for consumers to move devices between retailers. And I recognise that's a very complex sort of question, but I thought I'd kick it off with that.
Yeah, thanks, Anthony. It's a really interesting question. It's got a few different aspects to it. So, the switching. I'll start with the last point that you made around customer switching. So, obviously, from a consumer experience perspective, it would be great if they could buy a system and they could sign up to a VPP, and then if they're offered a better deal with a different VPP, then they could easily switch to that VPP. That kind of switchability, fosters competition, and competition is good for delivering the best consumer outcomes. So, some things that would be required to enable that switchability is potentially, where you have VPPs or aggregators that have integrated with a number of different technologies. Now, one way to achieve that ultimate level of switchability, I guess, if there was a standard way for all VPPs to communicate with their devices, potentially through that 2030.5. But then that is a trade-off between, facilitating that ultimate level of switchability, but also reducing the capability of VPPs to choose how they communicate with their devices. So there is a bit of a trade-off there. And that's going to be worked through in the DER-min connection standards and the outcomes from the ESP work as well. And then another element that was part of your question relates to what happens at the connection point. So this concept of dynamic operating envelopes, they're a really important concept to enable connection points to be able to export more potentially over the course of a year, and therefore for customers to be able to install bigger systems, and ultimately to export more to the grid over the course of a year, but on the proviso that when there's network congestion at particular times, that the exports can be reduced on a connection point basis, potentially to manage that congestion. And so this concept of the dynamic operating envelope is at the connection point. It's at the point of connection between the customer and the grid. And so there is a requirement for some smarts to be able to take a dynamic operating envelope from the distribution network and then to know what's happening at the connection point. That could be across a variety of different devices, and then to make sure that the operation of that connection point doesn't exceed the operating envelope. And so that very much is something that would require communication between different devices and communication between the entity responsible for that connection point, for the operation of those devices at that connection point, to engage with the DNSP to make sure that operation doesn't exceed the envelope. So yeah, again, like that, there's a lot of complexity in there that we as an industry need to work through over the next few months. Does that answer your question, Anthony? Did you want to pick anything up out of that?
No, I don't want to take up all the time, and I do appreciate that, Matt. Yeah, that's really useful feedback.
Okay, question from Patricia. Thanks, Patricia. So keen to see a normalised version of the FCAS income slide between the preceding chart showing the growth in participation and the chart showing what looks like slower growth in earnings. Okay, keen to understand return progression over the trial. Yeah, I think that's something that we certainly have the data to produce. So I think we could look at just producing a chart like that, just to give a bit more insight to what the expected earnings could be on a normalized basis, on a per megawatt basis. But I think broadly speaking, if you ignore the price, the event-driven spikes in revenues, then typically you might expect over the course of a year FCAS revenues to be around the 200 to 300 $5 a year mark, or something of that order. But then if you have a massive, separation event that causes a price spike over a sustained period of time, then it could be greater than that. But it's very, very difficult to forecast what those FCAS revenues might be, particularly with the forecast influx of large-scale batteries coming onto the grid that could provide these services, as well as the growth of VPPs. But then equally, there could be a greater need for more FCAS to be procured going forward. So there's there's lots of variables to consider when you're thinking about FCAS revenues going forward. So do price spikes generally happen during discharging, as per the graphs shown? So the price spikes and the discharging are really kind of coincident. Typically, it's obviously, price spikes are very circumstantial. They depend on what's happening on the grid at any given time, whether there's been any particular constraints binding or anything tripping which is causing a price spike. But typically, prices are higher in the evening peak and when there's more demand on the system, and particularly when there's PV, rooftop PV is now having particularly in springtime, a much bigger impact on wholesale prices. So if you got rooftop PV tailing off in the evening load coming on, then that's the typical time that you're likely to get price spikes in the wholesale market. It's also the typical time that VPPs might be discharging their batteries, because fundamentally the default mode of operation is still to maximize the self-consumption of their customers' PV, and so they're typically discharging in the evening, and so there's that kind of coincident action there. Any other questions? Does AEMO have a plan to roll out the DRSP program for VPPs? So I think you're referring there, Lucas, to DRSP, for those that don't know, is Demand Response Service Provider. It relates to the wholesale demand response rule change that AEMO is about to go live with later in October. So from that time, wholesale demand response will be a service that is in the market. It'll be a new service, and part of that is where DRSPs are effectively a type of virtual power plant. They're an aggregation, or can be an aggregation, of demand response resources that can respond to high prices in the market and reduce their load, and as a result they can take advantage of that high price to earn money in the wholesale market. So there are some similarities between the wholesale demand response requirements around telemetry, for instance, to what could be required or could occur as part of the scheduled light rule change. AEMO's currently putting together a rule change proposal for scheduled light, or for the first stage of that, and so that will be a process that will take the learnings from the VPP demonstrations, it'll take the learnings from wholesale demand response and the telemetry requirements around that, and then look to put forward something suitable for scheduled light going forward. But there's a lot of consultation with industry that needs to happen to work out exactly what scheduled light might look like, and that will follow the normal rule change process. So AEMO will put together a rule change proposal, submit that to the AMC, and then they'll start a consultation process. So, question from Pippa: one of the trickiest parts of designing VPP FCAS participation frameworks, balance between having sufficient comms and speed to verify the service has been delivered with minimizing the cost barrier to participation. any comment on this in the context of the trial learnings. Yeah, I think that's pretty accurate, Pippa. Yeah, the comms and speed to verify the service. The comms is less of an issue because the verification of FCAS, it's a service that is locally detected, locally delivered, and then the data to verify is sent to AEMO after the fact. So it's not a real-time data service to verify delivery of FCAS. We did have real-time data requirements in the demonstrations, but that was to observe the VPP responses to energy prices. So for FCAS, the potential barrier to entry that was the 50 millisecond sampling rate requirement at every site to require any VPP to have that 50 millisecond meter at every site. And so part of the demonstrations was to explore whether AEMO could reliably verify the delivery of FCAS using 1 second data, and that has been the subject, or one of the key subjects, of the mass consultation process. So in the demonstrations, we received that 1 second data to verify delivery of FCAS, and for the purposes of the demonstrations, that 1 second data was useful and sufficient to observe that VPPs can deliver the service. They're capable of delivering that service effectively. Whether or not that is suitable for the ongoing verification of FCAS delivery, that's really been the focus of that mass consultation, and that's reaching a conclusion later on this year. So encourage you to get involved in that. There's a webinar occurring on Friday, which we can send you an invite for, I think, if you like. Any other questions? All right, so yeah, if you want any, if anybody wants to get involved in that subsequent webinar on the mass consultation, just drop a little note into the chat. And if you have any further questions, feel free to reach out to drprogram@aemo.com.au. And Patricia, conscious about your question, feel free to drop me an email if you like, and we can explore that question further. But thanks all for your participation and engagement in this project throughout and on this webinar. It's been a wonderful project to be involved in. We've learnt heaps, and we hope that it's been useful for the industry too. So with that, cheerio.